I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Call. In 2016, today's guest, David Daley, wrote the best-selling book, Ratf, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. He exposed how Republicans were rigging democracy through redistricting. In 2010, Karl Rove, remember Karl Rove? He wrote, "When you draw the lines, you make the rules." And it worked. Republicans gained nearly 700 new seats and set the stage for unprecedented gerrymandering. Republicans won those seats, even though Democrats got more votes. The Republican Party's so-called Red Map program radically altered the country's electoral map. David Daley is out with a new book called Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. This time, he says we need to understand how voting rights got hijacked and how the Republican Party became so extreme. He says the takeover of U.S. elections began in a memo. It was drafted back in 1971 by Lewis Powell, a soon-to-be Nixon appointee to the High Court. That helped lay the groundwork for the modern war on voting rights. 10 years later, a young lawyer named John Roberts joined Ronald Reagan's Department of Justice to bring down the Voting Rights Act. In 2013, Supreme Court Justice John Roberts pulled it off by gutting what David Daley calls one of the most consequential decisions in modern jurisprudence. In addition to those two books, David Daley is also author of Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. He's also former editor-in-chief of Salon. Hi, David. Thanks so much for joining us, and congratulations on another important book.
Thank you, Rose. Thanks for having me back on.
Well, given that you have done so much work looking at how the system is rigged, from gerrymandering to the Voting Rights Act, given where we are right now, what concerns you the most?
This is a scary moment. I think what keeps me awake at night would be the fear of another Bush versus Gore style case coming straight at us after the election. It'll be 180 million of us will vote on November 5th, and then that's going to start a second election period, the 6-week sprint to certify elections, sometimes by county boards, state legislatures, secretaries of state. We saw in 2020 just how contentious and complicated that process can be, how wide open to chicanery it is. The right has been organizing those small, under-the-radar boards. We see it happening in swing states like Georgia right now before our eyes. And that 6-week period is really important because if the electors aren't ratified, if they aren't ready to cast their ballots in mid-December, it opens the door for all kinds of potential litigation that could result in cases before the Supreme Court on which slate of electors is appropriate, etc. There's a lot of different scenarios one could imagine as far as how this could get to the court. And if that's the case, 180 million of us will have voted, but the 9 on the court will ultimately decide. We saw this 24 years ago. It's not crazy to think that it could happen again. And 3 of the judges, the justices who are currently on the court, of course, were lawyers on George W. Bush's team in 2000. So in many ways, Bush versus Gore was proof of concept for the right's effort to capture the courts and a sign of just how consequential and important that branch can be.
David, I think we should spend a little more time on this because it is so important. We're definitely going to talk about your book. I'm hoping this will be one of a few conversations we have with you because the history is so important. Now, you wrote a piece for Salon recently looking at what we're dealing with right now. And a lot of people might be thinking, okay, Trump's not in office, so could he possibly still have his supporters go to D.C. like he did on January 6th? What else is he doing? And It's so interesting because in our series on Project 2025, so many of our guests say what happened during the first Trump administration is, first of all, they didn't really think they were going to win. Second, they didn't have people ready to go on day one. And so there was a lot of confusion. People really didn't know what they were doing. This time around will be completely different. We've been doing this whole series on Project 2025, and they are ready on day one. And so would you say that the same applies to the election? They're already laying the groundwork for all of these lawsuits that you lay out in this piece in Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada that seek to knock voters off the rolls in the weeks right before the election, as well as litigation in Nevada and elsewhere, hoping to void absentee ballots received after Election Day?
Yes, all of that is happening on the electoral side as well. The most famous image, perhaps, of the 2020 litigation was the clown car of Rudy Giuliani in front of Four Seasons Landscaping holding his ridiculous press conference, right? It's not going to be a Rudy Giuliani clown car sideshow this time. Republicans are organized and they're ready. There's already more than 75 cases that the Republican National Committee has either filed as a party to or has filed amicus briefs supporting. You've got the chair of the RNC is Trump's daughter-in-law, Laura. These cases are in 24 states right now, in all of the swing states that you have mentioned. The lawyers who are working on this are the white shoe firms that are most closely associated with establishment in Washington, D.C. It's firms that are populated with former Supreme Court clerks and whisperers and the like. So this effort is right at the heart of the modern Republican Party in a way that it was a little bit of a carnival in 2020. It's much better organized and planned out this time.
So talk about what else we need to know. We mentioned some of these lawsuits that could possibly knock people off the rolls in the weeks before the election. I've been talking about this. I feel like everyone in the media needs to do a public service to say, check your registration on a regular basis, no matter where you live, but especially if you live in a Republican-controlled state. Because are you saying that a couple weeks before the election, a lot of people might be knocked off the rolls? How are they going to find this out? And if they do, are they going to be able to re-register? I mean, what's in place to deal with this?
We saw 155,000 people in Ohio knocked off the ballot this week alone. So yes, this is happening. Voters are being removed from the rolls. You need to go to vote.org and you need to double check because it can be a laborious process. If you show up on election day to cast a ballot and your name is not there because you've been knocked off for whatever reason, it can be a tricky process to get back on. You might, the laws on that are going to depend state by state, but you might have to cast a provisional ballot. You might have to then take another trip to your city hall in the days afterwards with certain ID. It's going to be additional barriers put in front of you if that's the position you find yourself in. I think what happened in 2020, Republicans filed about 60 different lawsuits in that period after the election. And what they ran up against time after time was judges saying, you filed this too late. You've brought us your concerns after the election. And so what Republicans are doing now is they're trying to get out in front of that. They are filing these cases early. They are signaling, they are trying to ensure that what happened to them last time does not happen again in 2024 because they are better organized, better prepared, and are working with fresher legal theories developed by sharper minds.
You write that even if these cases go nowhere, they could basically just reinforce the idea out there that the election has been stolen and then cast doubt among the party's base about the process and the legitimacy of the results.
That's right. And I think we need to remember as well that time is not on the side of good government during that period. That is a 6-week period in which those who want to inflict chaos know that they can simply run out the clock and impose even more chaos. In many ways, the forces that want to inject doubt and chicanery during that period of time are going to be counting on the fact that if they can run out the clock, if they can slow this process down and push it into state legislatures in their states, if Georgia or Arizona is super close, Wisconsin, right? States that were super close last time. And if you can drag this out in such a way that you can create the possibility of those state legislatures saying, we have to protect our state's voice in the Electoral College. We're going to name a slate and send them to Washington. A slate that may or may not be representative of the popular vote in that state. You are setting the stage for all kinds of trouble. And we need to keep in mind the very key footnote in Bush v. Gore from then Chief Justice Rehnquist, who John Roberts clerked for, that made clear that states are well within their rights to try to protect their voice in such a way. He made certain that Florida had the recount there in 2000 dragged on. Florida was within their rights to have the legislature look to name electors. So that to me feels like what we need to be thinking about and worried about.
So are you saying that Kamala Harris needs to win by massive, massive numbers so this doesn't happen?
This will be much harder to pull off if the numbers are big. Florida was able to go to the Supreme Court because we were talking about just over 500 votes that separated Al Gore and George W. Bush in the tipping point state. If it is that close again, it's hard to imagine that this does not go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Last time around, the election was not close enough for that strategy to sow the kind of chaos successfully. Certainly they tried to sow a lot of chaos. It didn't work. You could imagine that you could have a different outcome if this election is super close.
You write about this elite Washington, D.C. law firm that's deeply connected to the Republican and conservative legal movement. Can you tell us about Consovoy McCarthy?
Sure. Consovoy McCarthy is one of the, absolute elite white shoe conservative law firms. And if you dig down deep into just about every piece of significant litigation that has worked to narrow the Voting Rights Act or has worked to perpetuate Republican conservative interests, you scratch a little bit, you begin to see Consovoy McCarthy right there. It's a firm certainly that there's a bit of a pipeline from Clarence Thomas clerks straight into this firm. You can see the influence of the Federalist Society, of Leonard Leo, of the big guns of the conservative legal movement, when they are involved in a case. It's different from Rudy Giuliani being involved in a case, or Cleta Mitchell, right? Or sort of some of the people who it's a little bit easier to dismiss their lunacy. The folks at Convoy McCarthy are as serious as a heart attack.
Today, we are spending the hour with David Daley, who is out with a new book called Antidemocratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. He says he wrote this book because we need to understand how voting rights got hijacked, how we got here, and how the Republican Party became so extreme. And he goes deep into history, which is so important. And we'll definitely get to that. We'll have David back to spend more time on that. But we wanted to really spend the first part of the show talking about what is currently happening on the ground. David's got a piece out in Salon called GOP Plans to Win This Election in Court, If Not at the Ballot Box. So we're going to keep repeating this on the show, and we hope that others in the media do the same. It is very important to check your voter registration, especially if you live in a Republican-controlled state or in a swing state, because as David and now others are reporting, there are a lot of lawsuits out there that seek to push people off of the rolls basically knock them off the rolls in the weeks before the election. Lawsuits in Michigan, Arizona, and Nevada. David writes about litigation in Nevada and elsewhere, hoping to void absentee ballots received after Election Day. So, David, tell us what is going on out there, especially in swing states. The New York Times has a really important piece that came out by Tiffany Shu yesterday called "Election Officials Battle a Deluge of Disinformation. County clerks and secretaries of state are overwhelmed this year as they stare down a perpetual moving target of new conspiracy theories, political pressure, and threats." So these election officials are having to deal with the death threats, the conspiracy theories, while at the same time, they're going to deal with all of this confusion from people who say, wait a minute, I'm not on the rolls. And then there's the lawsuits. So what are secretaries of state doing in these swing states? And what are, pro voting rights lawyers doing in these states to deal with these lawsuits?
It's hard to imagine why anybody would want those jobs. And perhaps that's also part of the attempt here, is to make work and life so difficult for these honorable people just trying to serve democracy in their communities. No, but it's a very serious problem. The sorts of threats that election officials face every day are growing and mounting. When you talk to election officials and they play their voicemail for you, the vile hatred and the horrible language and the violence that is imputed against them and their families is outrageous. And the levels of misinformation and disinformation are just so high. You have folks who are convinced that there's voter fraud, or that there's, ballots from, being counted twice, or what were the crazy things that were being imputed after 2020, that they were being ballots were being imported from Central American countries, right? And we laugh because it sounds ridiculous, but these stories take on life in conservative media. They get repeated, they get shared, they get believed. And it all manifests itself, in very real and frightening ways. One thing that all of us can do to step up for our democracy is to volunteer as poll workers, to get out there and to really be the front lines of folks who are registering and checking folks in on election day. But I can also understand why, given the threats, that it's not the most appealing job right now.
What about the systems in place to deal with these lawsuits and these efforts to push people off the rolls right before the election?
Um, there are wonderful voting rights groups out there that are doing the work. The folks at vote.org and the umbrella of civil rights and voting rights organizations that run that site, the folks running the election protection hotlines that can connect people to lawyers immediately if they need help at the polls. But all of this again, I mean, so much of it is just playing whack-a-mole. When you're constantly on defense against this kind of threat, it requires an awful lot of work and energy and investment simply to keep people registered and standing in line and dealing with all of the bureaucratic barriers that are being created. And that is energy that's not being spent on other issues and other kind of enthusiasm generation. And again, so much of this is traceable to this Supreme Court and the John Roberts decision in Shelby County, in which Roberts insists, without any evidence, that things have changed in the South and the kinds of protections that were offered by the Voting Rights Act no longer were relevant. They'd been eclipsed by history, Roberts suggested. And it only took an hour for Texas to enact its voter ID bill that the state would admit was designed in such a way that it kept more than 600,000 registered voters, U.S. citizens who were Latino in the state of Texas, from voting because they lacked the kinds of ID that was required. Things did not change in the South. It's simply that John Roberts removed the protections of the Voting Rights Act. And when he did, all of these dark forces that had been barely concealed rushed forth. All of these things that we're talking about, whether it's a precinct closures or changes in voter registration procedures or knocking people off the ballot in these states. It was not possible to do this when the full protections of the Voting Rights Act existed. John Roberts made all of this possible.
And as you write in your book, and we'll go into more detail about this, you write that this has been John Roberts' mission because he actually joined the Department of Justice under Ronald Reagan in 1981 when he was a young lawyer.
Yes, this is John Roberts' life's work, working to make it harder for people to vote. I found a memo that Roberts wrote as a young man at the Department of Justice in which he says, proving a Voting Rights Act claim should not be made too easy. Well, he has certainly dedicated himself to ensuring that it would be as difficult as possible. Roberts comes into the Reagan administration, into the Department of Justice, fresh off his clerkship for Rehnquist at the U.S. Supreme Court. And immediately he is thrown into the debate over the 1982 reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. And Congress wanted to make some important fixes to the VRA in order to guard against a couple of decisions that the Supreme Court had made. And Roberts was very much opposed to this. And as a young man, 26, 27, he is really leading the charge at the Department of Justice, trying to prevent what Congress was trying to do, what a bipartisan Congress was trying to do, a Republican Senate, a Democratic House, a Republican president. And in memo after memo, Roberts is strident and determined, and very much focused on this. And he loses. Roberts and his allies in this fight, folks like Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond, the kinds of arch segregationists you would expect to find on the other side of a voting rights case. They lost that time, but Roberts learned an important lesson through that fight, and so did the conservative legal movement that wanted to cement control over the VRA and to make it harder for people to vote. They learned that maybe they would not be able to win something that was as popular. Voting rights was like fighting against, baseball, apple pie, and motherhood in Congress. You were not going to be successful with that, but it would be a whole lot easier. The fight would be very different if all you had to do was place 5 like-minded people on the U.S. Supreme Court. Suddenly, it wouldn't matter if you couldn't get to 218 in the House or 51 in the Senate. The magic number you needed was 5.
We're going to take a quick break. Today we are spending the hour with David Daley, who's out with a new book called Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. In 2016, he wrote the best-selling book Ratf, The True Story Behind the Secret Plan to Steal America's Democracy. In that book, he exposed how Republicans were rigging democracy through redistricting. In this book, it really goes deep into the Voting Rights Act. He says we need to understand how voting rights got hijacked. You can join us at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. I'm Rose Aguilar. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. We are looking for a few social media volunteers. So if you're interested in working with us 1 or 2 days a week, it is remote. Please email your call at kalw.org. And we're also going to keep repeating these public service announcements. Be sure that you are registered to vote because there are many efforts out there to push people off the rolls. Be sure to spread the word about this. You can go to vote.org. And then also just be wary of all of the spam that's out there. I'm getting more text messages than ever asking for money for this candidate or that candidate. A lot of this is spam. So be sure if you want to give money or give your personal information, just be sure to check that it's legitimate. There's just a lot of spam out there. In fact, even spam about registering to checking your registration. So just make sure that anytime you're offering money or your personal information, you're giving it to an official organization or an official website. Today, we're spending the hour with David Daley, who's out with a new book called Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. He says the takeover of elections began with the Powell memo in 1971, a soon-to-be Nixon appointee to the High Court. And then, of course, we're talking about John Roberts joining Reagan's Department of Justice, eventually making his way to the Supreme Court, and then completely gutting the Voting Rights Act. David, I want to ask you a question I think about a lot, and I wish that it got more attention in the media. Given all of the work that you have been doing on trying to expose just what is happening with this rigged system, in some ways, we wouldn't even be talking about a lot of this if it weren't for the Electoral College. And I just wonder, why don't we talk about that more in this country? All of the wasted airtime on Trump and just it's unbelievable what the guy is saying lately. To me, it's like we need to talk about poverty and climate change and homelessness. There's so many issues. We're wasting so much time. We don't have a choice. But we wouldn't be talking about a lot of this if it weren't for the Electoral College. Why don't we talk about that more in this country?
That's a great question. We don't talk about any of the real structural problems that get in the way of solving the problems that most people want to see solved, right? I mean, there's some real agreement on many of the issues you just talked about, climate and poverty and student loans and healthcare. There's a way forward on all of these things. And what so often gets in the way is an electoral college that twice this century alone has produced a president who lost the popular vote. Those two presidents, by the way, appointed 5 of the 6 conservative justices to the U.S. Supreme Court. But we also don't ever talk about the structural inequities of the U.S. Senate. It's said that by 2035, 70% of the country is going to live in 15 states, which means 70% of us will have 30 senators, and the other 30% from those smaller, whiter, more conservative rural states will have 70 senators. You combine that plus the filibuster, you begin to see how it's a real veto power for the minority. And then you add in gerrymandering and redistricting, which has gone so wild in so many states, pushing politics to the extreme and pushing so many districts to be non-competitive. There's a lot of knots in the system that stand in the way of basic majoritarianism.
Mm. And it's just, I think it's so important to talk about this. I mean, to remember the 2000 election, Bush got 50.4 million votes. Gore got 50.9 million. Ralph Nader got 2.8 million. And then if you look at Clinton and Trump got 62.9 million. Hillary Clinton got 65.8 million. I just don't understand why we're not talking about this more, because this system is so undemocratic and it's really an outlier in the entire world.
That's right. You would never design a system this way if you were designing one now. When you describe it to friends, right? I mean, imagine describing this system to your 10-year-old or something as they learn about it. So every state votes, and then they get the number of members of Congress that they have. And those members of Congress get to effectively draw their own district lines. And the U.S. Supreme Court is filled with justices who are given these spots for life. When you look overseas, other modern democracies, they don't appoint justices for life. They appoint them for a specific period of time, usually around 10 or 12 years. So we are a wild outlier on all of these issues. And until we start to fix them, and fixing them is not easy by any means, but fixing the structural problems stands in the way of fixing the policy problems.
And we've talked about this many times. You have to wonder, where are the Democrats in all of this? I mean, in the year 2000, why didn't they take on the Electoral College? I think about that also. In fact, Tony has a very related question. So let's hear from Tony in San Leandro. Hi, Tony.
Hello. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I am definitely puzzled on why the Democratic Party has not addressed this issue, except for a very small minority, AOC, Sanders, Warren, a few others. And, of course, they're considered on the left-wing fringe wackos to even bring this up. So it's extremely puzzling to me why, if they see what the Republicans are doing, they just don't respond by putting the facts on the table and fighting back.
Thanks, Tony. Your thoughts, David?
Yeah, I'd like to nominate Tony to be the chair of the Democratic National Committee. I mean, I think he's got the right idea. We have to talk about this stuff and fight back if we're going to fix it. There were a lot of us back in 2020 that were jumping up and down about structural issues and saying the U.S. Supreme Court has got, we have to add justices, we have to enact an ethics code, we should talk about term limits. And And the president, a Democratic president who had a trifecta in Washington, commissioned a blue ribbon panel, stuffed the result in a drawer. And then what happened, right? We had the Dobbs decision that ended abortion rights in much of the country. We had the decision in the Trump immunity case that effectively said that Donald Trump is above the law and can get away with crimes that he committed in office. We had the Chevron decision and the gutting of the regulatory state. And now the Democrats are talking a little bit about ethics, about term limits. So I'm glad that we're finally having that conversation, but we need to pick it up. It needs to become at the heart of the Democratic Party, because, I mean, Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural back in 1861 said that the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon the vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by the decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers. And I think we're in that moment now where we're in danger of the people ceasing to become their own rulers. And so we have to speak up loud and clear about the need for reform. The good news is that Americans want to see this reform. There was even a Fox News poll this year that suggested about 3/4 of Americans wanted to see term limits for Supreme Court justices. That seems like it's a pretty good place for us to start.
Thank you for the call, Tony. Let's go next to Greg in Palo Alto. Hi, Greg.
I hope you can hear me because the radio broadcast has been pretty sketchy. I was concerned about a couple of things. One, I remember the Roberts hearings where he talked about only calling balls and strikes. All right, that was his phrase. And he committed perjury during those hearings, but he was never held accountable. The other thing that I'm concerned about is that in states like Georgia and Florida, according to Greg Palast, there's a huge movement going on where voters are being disenfranchised. People are challenging voters in just unbelievable numbers. And it looks like a lot of people could lose their vote, the ability to vote, in which case that's going to hurt the possibility of the Democrats winning. And I just don't know if your guest if you've already commented on this or if you have something to say about it.
Yes, it's very disconcerting. The laws have been changed. Republicans are no longer under the consent decree that they had been under for decades that stopped them from this kind of aggressive challenging of voters at the polls, and we're going to see an awful lot of it. People are going to have to bring ID with them. People are going to have to be ready to stand up and defend themselves. They're going to have to be ready to be intimidated at the polls. John Roberts says that things have changed in the South, but very little has changed in the South. It's not violence anymore, but it's a different kind of intimidation. It's bureaucratic violence, and it's every bit as disenfranchising. As far as the Chief Justice goes, your caller's exactly right. And I walk through in the book a handful of places where I think the Chief Justice was very dishonest and approaching really lying about his record, especially his record on voting rights in his confirmation hearings. There's an entire back and forth that he has with Senator Kennedy that I think has got some real issues there. But Roberts said that he would call balls and strikes. He insisted that he would just be an umpire, that he was modest and humble, that he was from Indiana, where he remembered the farmland stretching out to the horizon. You could almost hear the John Cougar Mellencamp song in the distance as he talked. And he created a myth for himself, a really valuable myth, because it's still with him in the mainstream media, and the Supreme Court reporters still often buy into it, but Roberts hasn't called balls and strikes. Roberts calls balls and strikes the way Leslie Nielsen calls balls and strikes in the movie The Naked Gun, if you remember that, where the pitch leaves the pitcher's hands, and he's already called it. Roberts has rewritten the rule book and changed the very nature of the game in order to advantage his team. John Roberts is less the Chief Justice of the United States than he is the most successful Republican politician of his generation. He has delivered to the Republican Party victory after victory on voting rights, on campaign finance, on gun control, on abortion, on the regulatory state. He has delivered them victories that they could never win through the political process, and he's done so via the courts. And that's not balls and strikes. That's not umpiring. That is, that's the people ceasing to be their own rulers.
Well, thank you for the call, Greg. We've got Peter in Florida next. Peter, thanks for calling. If you don't mind, I have a question for you since you're in Florida. Are these voting issues receiving attention in your local media? And what concerns you, if anything, about what's happening on the ground in Florida? Do we have Peter? Did we lose Peter? There you are. Hi, Peter.
Oh, you're my local media. I don't pay attention to what's going on around me. With the internet, anyway. So yeah, because what I was, and I'll ask your guest this question, because I think about this in terms of, I see as a problem is that your vote. In other words, if you get this many senators, this and that, and appointing Supreme Court justice, there is so much at stake with your vote that if government was like not so consequential, if government was much more inconsequential, in other words, everything from some of the things you mentioned, like abortion rights, prayer in school, if it was like if there was not much at stake, then it really wouldn't matter. Then you could decide people by lottery. If there wasn't much at stake, we wouldn't care. And so I think that's one of my thoughts. Is like, of course we're going to fight tooth and nail when there's so much at stake with every election. And so I'm saying that should be pulled back. And anyways, because you're in California, do you realize that your vote in California is worth 5 times less than your vote in Wyoming?
Yep.
I mean, you do the math, right?
Yeah, exactly, Peter. And
they
thank
say
you.
One man, one vote. But where are you voting? If you're voting in Wyoming, your vote's worth 5 times more.
Well, thank you, Peter. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the undemocratic system, talking about the Senate, right? David, I mean, Peter makes a good point there.
No, Peter nailed it. I mean, first he nailed it on the consequential stakes, but also on the nature of the U.S. Senate. I mean, the numbers are stark, and they are getting starker as time goes on. The Senate is really going to become the most anti-democratic branch of our government.
Thank you for the call, Peter. David, I want to ask you before we end the show today, and we'll definitely have you back to go deeper into your book. We really have to talk about the racial elements around all of this. You write, after the 1965 Voting Rights Act finally set a multiracial nation on a path toward multiracial democracy that had not been assured even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the Supreme Court and the forces of regression pulled it backward, in part, all with that district line no one could see in a city called, is it Calera?
Calera, yes.
Okay, Calera, located in Shelby County, Alabama. So you actually start your introduction by telling us what happened in Calera. This is so important. This tends to sometimes get lost or put aside when we talk about voting rights, but we have to talk about race. So tell us about Calera.
Absolutely. And I think you're exactly right, because race is at the heart of the Voting Rights Act. It's really the question that's at the heart of the American experiment and what our democracy is and who is involved and who has a voice and who does not. And prior to the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments after the Civil War, it was only white men who had that right. The Reconstruction Amendments begin to breathe life into the idea of a multiracial democracy. And the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal government, in a series of cases in the 1870s, begins to really choke that off, and it leads to a century of Jim Crow violence across the South. Alabama really is the heart of so much of that violence. It's the heart of the right to vote. And what the Supreme Court did, what the Voting Rights Act did in 1965 was it enacted something called preclearance, which effectively was probation. The states that had the worst records, the records of ingeniously defying the Constitution for the past 100 years, nothing else had worked. So they were told, if you want to make any change at all to your voting procedures, you are going to have to run them past the Department of Justice first and prove that there's not a secret racial motivation buried underneath. So fast forward up to 2006, 2007, the first black city councilor is elected in a small town in Alabama called Calera. And the white power structure in Alabama responds by immediately redistricting. And they turn this man's district effectively inside out. It is now a 30% black, 70% white district, and he loses the next election. The trouble is, Alabama, the folks in Calera, did not go to the Department of Justice first and pre-clear those changes. They did not go to the Department of Justice and pre-clear more than 100 annexations that had made the town larger over the years and required the redistricting. And those also needed approval of the Department of Justice. And when they didn't do any of those things, the Department of Justice voided the election, required it to be run on the old map. They said, you didn't follow the law here. And that is the heart of the Shelby County case. Shelby County goes to the U.S. Supreme Court and says preclearance ought to be unconstitutional because things have changed in the South and we shouldn't be treated differently than any other state and we shouldn't be under the thumb of the federal government. And it's not 1965 anymore. But this is absurd, right? Because they just have proven how it's sort of still 1965 in these places because they're still not following the law. And so I know we're running out of time, but let me just drive this home super quick. The Supreme Court in the Shelby County case does indeed agree with Calera and Shelby County. John Roberts ends preclearance and eviscerates the most successful enforcement mechanism of the most important civil rights legislation the country has ever known. And he does so because he says that things have changed. But the case itself is an example of how nothing has changed. And the fact that the very moment that Roberts does this, all of these new laws come out again across the South is just additional proof for anybody who has eyes and cares to see that these forces were unleashed by his decision. They were given power and they rushed out and immediately made the most of it. And it has remade the very nature of some of these states, and it could, again, have profound implications for all of us in the 2024 election.
In our remaining minute, just to repeat this district in Calera County turned 71% Black to nearly 70% white. Is this happening in other small towns across this country, and we're just not hearing about it?
Well, it's happening now, and now it's perfectly legal, thanks to John Roberts. Now that can happen without preclearance. And so
how often is this happening?
Oh, it's happening all the time. I mean, it's happening in every redistricting at the state level. It's happening in many redistrictings at the local level. So in a case like the Dobbs decision, right, where the U.S. Supreme Court insists we're not taking away abortion rights, we are returning to the people and their elected representatives a contentious, important issue for them to debate. What they know full on is that they are returning this to state legislative maps that they've already rigged in their favor. This is not a fair game. This is a hermetically closed circle. And what we're seeing in this kind of redistricting process, a state like Texas, where all of the population growth is driven by Latino and Black citizens, and yet you see white political power growing in the state legislature. All of this is attributed to the Shelby County decision and John Roberts.
And you just reminded me of a Washington Post piece that just came out. Here's the headline. Women say Texas hospitals denied them abortions for ectopic pregnancies. 2 women are filing complaints against hospitals in Texas, saying that they turned them away for emergency care, risking their lives. It is all so connected. David Daley is out with a new book called Antidemocratic, Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. Thank you so much for your work, David. We'd love to have you back to continue this discussion. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Rose. Thank you.
Thanks to Kevin Vance for engineering today's show, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.